All right, Chapter 6, Lesson 1. Civics fans, this is about the First Amendment, one of my favorite amendments. So there are other good amendments out there? Sure. First Amendment is up there. But first, a question for you. Do you want to see a civics teacher cry?
If it's you, yeah.
Unfortunately, we do not do a good job in teaching Americans about the First Amendment. And it's a shame. It contains 5 key rights. So if you look at this, we do okay with freedom of speech. Almost 70% of Americans can probably say the First Amendment includes freedom of speech. But the rest of them, religion, press, assembly, look at poor petition down here. Like nobody realizes the freedom of petition is one of your First Amendment rights. So this is one of the reasons why I keep hitting on the First Amendment. And hopefully if you learn one thing this year that you can repeat in 8th grade or 9th grade, it's the different parts of the First Amendment. Okay. We will try to keep remembering religion, speech, press, assembly, petition. Let's remember our little memory aid, RSPAP, to remember those 5 key freedoms. RSPAP.
How's that useful?
Religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. You don't have any little memory aids like that for you?
You need to create a mnemonic.
Yeah, I know.
RSPAP can mean anything.
I know. We'll work on that. All right. We'll start off with this idea of civil liberties. It's pretty easy. Civil comes from the same root as civics or citizen. So civil means of the citizens, and liberty is a fancy word for rights. So civil liberties is a fancy term for the rights you have as a citizen. A key thing that you need to understand when understanding your rights, particularly the idea of free speech, is these rights protect you from the government. These rights are limits on government power. When we talk about freedom of speech, we mean the government can't arrest you for things you say. It doesn't mean anything else. Can your neighbor punch you in the nose? Can your wife divorce you? Can your mom take away your cell phone? Can you lose followers on Instagram? Can you get kicked off of Twitter for things you say? Yes, because none of that is First Amendment. First Amendment protects your rights from the government. You can say pretty much anything you want, freedom of speech, and the government can't throw you in jail. It doesn't mean people will like what you say. Like this slide, freedom of speech says you could say what you want, but it's not like there isn't potential consequences. Again, you can say, hey, I'm Steve, I'm a Nazi. I hate pretty much everybody. They should all either die or go back to their other countries. Is that protected free speech? Yes. Can the government arrest you for that? No. Do your kids have to still love you? No. Can you get kicked off of Twitter? Maybe. That is not free speech. You are not free from all consequences of speech. The government can't arrest you for your free speech. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Hit it again, because I want people to understand this. Because you hear a lot of misunderstandings about freedom of speech, particularly out there today. You can say things that people consider wrong, and they can think you are a jerk that is different than the government swooping in, the FBI throwing a bag over your head and dragging you away and throwing you in jail. You're protected from the FBI dragging you away. Free speech. You're not protected from fellow citizens thinking you're a horrible human being. So, freedom of religion. There's 2 parts of freedom of religion. Do you know what one or both of the parts of freedom of religion are, Abby?
You can practice any religion you want.
Yes.
And your government can't force a religion on you?
Yes. There's 2 parts of freedom of religion. First is what's called the Establishment Clause. The government can't create its own government-sponsored religion. 2, free exercise clause. The government can't prevent you from worshiping the way you want. Now today we're like, gee, that's silly. Would a government ever create a religion or sponsor a religion? Yes. England. The King of England at one time made himself the head of the English church. So in England, religion and government were tied together. That's a bad thing, particularly if you don't want to be part of the religion that's sponsored by your government. That is why many people left their countries, to include England, for religious freedom. They come here to Massachusetts to have their own religions because they didn't want to worship the way a government told them to. Cool. Some people find this controversial and will add some stuff for you to read if you're one of those people that find it controversial. In a letter, President Jefferson calls this a wall of separation between church and state, and you'll hear that a lot. The idea is, let government, state, do government things. Let religion and people do religion things. Let's keep this wall between them. The government does not have any role or business in saying stuff about religion, promoting religion, sponsoring religion, or interfering with how you worship. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You will often hear this wall of separation line. You could read this on your own. Some people really care, because there is some debate about what wall of separation means. I leave this slide in here. If you want to look at it on your own, you can see what Jefferson was talking about when he said a wall of separation between church and state. But it's there. A Supreme Court Justice, Moore, this is his interpretation of this idea of wall of separation between church and state. Let government do government things. Let religions and people do religious things. Don't let these things intermingle. Hugo Black. You can worship any way you please, or you don't have to worship at all. That's the free exercise clause of religion. You want to be Catholic, you want to be Protestant, you want to be Baptist, you want to be Jewish, you want to worship the flying spaghetti monster, you want to worship Satan, or do you want to be completely atheist and have no religious beliefs at all? All these things are permissible under the First Amendment. The government can't swoop in and arrest you for your religious beliefs. Still makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
What's he got on his head?
A colander.
A colander. What do you use a colander for?
Draining things like pasta.
So when you make your pasta or your spaghetti, you drain it in a colander. I bring this up. There is a religion called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Their idea of their God, their deity, is basically a thing of spaghetti with 2 meatballs for eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And part of their religion, they say, their religious headgear is a pasta strainer. So this guy said, part of my religion is I wear a pasta strainer on my head. So when he got his driver's license, he took a picture wearing a pasta strainer. His argument was that was his freedom of religion right, that the state of Arizona couldn't force him to take that picture without the pasta strainer on his head. So this is some of the extent people get into when they're talking about freedom of religion. You ever heard of that?
This story?
Yes.
No, I've never. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
I do find it interesting, and I like talking about it when I talk about freedom of religion. Freedom of speech. You can say pretty much whatever you want. We're going to see there are some limits and restrictions, but in general you can say anything you want without having to worry about the government snatching you up and arresting you. Freedom of speech is particularly critical in that speech can be criticizing the government. Because let's face it, you have freedom of speech to talk about how much you like Harry Styles, right?
Yep.
Is that protected free speech?
Absolutely.
Sure. But can we argue that's not really what the First Amendment is about? Sure. First Amendment is really about your freedom to criticize the government. Because if there's going to be a certain speech the government doesn't allow, it's exactly that. So the real idea here is I am free to criticize the government without the FBI swooping in and arresting me. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Speech just doesn't mean speech. The Supreme Court has ruled that free speech is art. Free speech is music, and it can include things like clothing. So I put these two pictures on here to talk about two Supreme Court cases. The first one we'll talk about in class. These are the Tinker kids. Mary Beth, and now I can't remember the brother's name, but Mary Beth was in 8th grade. The brother was a sophomore in high school. They were protesting the Vietnam War. They wore the armbands you see there. Do you recognize that symbol?
Yes, it's a peace sign.
It's the peace symbol. So part of their protest against the Vietnam Wars, they wore these armbands with the peace symbol on. Their principals told them that if they wore those armbands, they would be suspended. So they wore the armbands, and they were suspended. Their parents sued, saying that these students had the right, the free speech right, to wear those armbands. The case goes to the Supreme Court, and what did the Supreme Court say?
They said that, yes, they were protected, right?
The Supreme Court, not even close, in a vote of 7-2, said the Tinker kids their free speech rights were violated by the school.
Yeah.
That those armbands were equivalent to protected political speech.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Like, they were allowed
Yes.
to wear them, yeah.
The justice who writes the majority opinion in this says, hey, you do not lose your First Amendment rights when you walk into the schoolhouse gate. It's not magic. It's not like you walk into school and you lose all your rights. No. It may seem like it in school that you have no rights, because one of the first things we do is tell you the code of conduct and give you a list of all these things you can't do. Great. The Tinker versus Des Moines School District Supreme Court ruling says, in this case, that wearing those armbands was protected free speech, that the school could not suspend the kids for that.
I learned about another case where some students wrote some articles in their school newspaper, and the whole page with the stories were the principal pulled them out and said,
Yes.
You can't publish these.
Yes.
In that case, they decided basically the opposite, because it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, yes, your First Amendment right to free speech is limited
Yes.
in the school. So did that kind of like halfway reverse this, or how does that work?
I mentioned the case that you're talking about, Abby, which is
Mhm.
called Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer.
Yeah.
And then I also talk about this. Can you see the sign that these kids are holding?
Bong hits for Jesus.
What's a bong?
Thing that you smoke weed out of.
It's something, it's a device, basically a pipe that you use to smoke marijuana. All right, so these are high school kids. I think their high school was in Alaska. It's 2002. They show up to a school assembly with this banner that says, Bong hits for Jesus. Obviously, not obviously, these students were trying to make a point. An assistant principal sees this sign, freaks out, runs over there, takes the sign away from the kids. The kids get suspended, and the kids are like, aha! We're going to sue, and we're going to win. Why? Because they thought they were covered by the Supreme Court ruling in the Tinker case. Nope. Supreme Court said, nope. Protected free speech, not protected free speech. The Supreme Court's going to argue, and this is a little tricky. The Supreme Court basically says schools are special places. Schools need to be able to protect their students' safety and be able to do their job without disruption. They need to be able to teach kids. They need to be able to keep kids safe. They need to be able to do their job of teaching kids. Supreme Court will argue that this is protected free speech. This is designed to cause disruptions, and schools need to keep kids safe from drugs, which is an issue with school-age students. So this in particular was not protected speech, so it was right for the school to suspend these kids. Now, do we have to agree with these things? No, you can argue and say, maybe the Supreme Court got it wrong. I'm here to present that you have this exactly right, Abby. If you just look at the Tinker case, you're like, wow, my rights are protected in school. I have all these rights. I never would have thought. Yeah. These other Supreme Court cases say not so much. The case you're talking about is this case called Kuhlmeyer versus Hazelwood School District versus Kuhlmeyer. These students write a school newspaper, and they wrote some articles that the principal didn't like. One was about divorce.
And the other was about teen pregnancy.
Yes.
And they got firsthand accounts from some of the students.
Exactly. So they're writing about divorce and teen pregnancy. The principal flips his or her lid, doesn't let the students print this. The students are like, First Amendment, speech or press, you pick. We're protected. This is protected free speech. And the Supreme Court kind of surprises us. If you think they're going to rule like they did at Tinker, they said, nah, school's a special place. School administrators do have this job of being able to keep the kids safe and do their job without disruption. So it's easy to look at these cases and say, is the Supreme Court really consistent here?
I think there's a huge difference between the bong hits for Jesus and the divorce article in a school newspaper.
Yes.
And I think it's a bit, especially with the article one, it's a bit hypocritical.
Yes.
They can wear an armband with the peace sign on it, and
Yes.
that's protected, but you can't write about,
Divorce and teen pregnancy.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's not disruptive. It's not hateful.
You could definitely argue that. I don't know any more to convince you because that's not really my job. My job isn't to kind of defend what the Supreme Court does. My job is to explain what they did and why they said they did it. The Supreme Court, after Tinker, seemed to go out of its way to kind of limit rights and put these things back in their box. You can see them thinking, it's like, oh man,
Oh crap.
we gave these
They're gonna think they
students
have
a
rights.
whole bunch of rights. What if they just start going nuts? So they start whittling it away. And two, this case was decided in 1968. This case was decided in 2007. Kuhlmeyer is 1986. So are these all the same Supreme Court justices?
No.
No. They change over time. Good observations. I can only say that you have rights as a student. This case proves it. Are these rights as broad as you think they may be? No. You're not going to be able to go into your school with your t-shirt on that says, I love drugs. Let me smoke more weed. I love smoking crack. Probably not going to get away with that. Can you wear a t-shirt that says, I don't like the U.S. government? That is probably protected free speech. Do you see the difference there, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah. The Supreme Court would probably say there's a difference between the two. Good thoughts, though. Freedom of the press. What is the press? Newspapers, TV news reporters, internet websites. We have this idea that our press, our media needs to be free. We examine in 1733, there's this guy named Zanger. He writes a newspaper in New York. The governor of New York arrests him because he was writing stories critical of the governor of New York. When he goes on trial, he wins the case. So even in 1733, well before the Revolution and well before the Constitution, we already had this idea that the press needs to be free. If we don't have a free press, we can't be free citizens. We talk about popular sovereignty. I'm in charge of the government, right? Because I vote. But if I don't know what the government's doing, do I really have any kind of power over the government? No. Any government that can control the press takes power away from me as a citizen. I need that free press to tell me what's going on. Do you know what the president's doing today?
I could look and find out
Where?
on Twitter or on
Right.
news places.
Can you find out on your own?
Yes.
I mean, on your own, without the press.
Oh no.
Could you drive to Washington and knock on the door of the White House and say, what's going on in here?
No.
No, we can't do that as citizens, right? We rely on a free press to tell us what our government's doing. And this Zanger case is one of those first things in American history that say, gee, this is important, it's a right we need to protect. So this is the type of stuff you should see in the media. If the media is just reporting sports scores, I mean, is that free press? Sure, but does that really matter? Eh. If the media is just reporting about is that Jake Paul who just had a boxing match?
Yeah.
Yeah. They could report that. Are they protected? Is that protected free speech? Sure. Does it really matter?
No.
No. The press is there to write stuff that's critical of our government. So we know what our government's doing. So stories like this protected free speech because citizens should be able to rely on a free press to tell them what their government's doing. Oh, a local story. This guy named Thompson was mayor of Milton for like 40 years. It's not like the presidency here where you just do 2 terms. So Mayor Thompson loses an election to West Nice. He used to teach history here. He gets a job running a charity here. He stole a bunch of money from it. The FBI caught him, and now he's in jail for like 6 years. This is the job of the media, to tell us what our government's doing. Does it tell us what the latest fashion is and what entertainers are doing and what sports is doing? But where is it critical? Telling us what our government's doing. Or otherwise, we have no idea. Censorship is when the government limits what the press can say. Here we don't have censorship. A place like China, though, if Abby's a reporter in China, she writes the story and then gives it to the government media dude or dudette and says, here's my story. And then the government media dude says, you can write this, but you can't write that. Here's your story back. That's called censorship. Anytime your government is trying not to let you know stuff, censorship, our free press says our government can't censor information. Oh, but are there some limits? Really narrow. For example, does the government have like top secret military information that it doesn't want the Russians and Chinese to know? Yes. Can a reporter get in trouble if they like print top secret military information? We're gonna attack ISIS tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. That's probably a limit on what the press can do.
So, you know those clips of like the UFOs that like CIA released like a few months ago? How and why would they keep that footage or information from us?
First, the government doesn't always do a good job. Sometimes the military classifies stuff that they shouldn't. But here's generally what the military will say. Okay, the military has capabilities that it doesn't want the enemy to know about. So let's say we have this super secret satellite that could take these cool pictures. Do we want the bad guys to know about that? No.
Why?
Because we don't want the bad guys to know what we could possibly know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that would be classified. So if I'm a reporter and somehow I get pictures that this satellite has taken, yeah, I'm not supposed to print that stuff. Only the government can release that stuff. There's massive problems in that because there's stuff that probably wouldn't hurt the United States if we released it, but somebody in the government could say that's top secret, and now if I try to tell anybody about this stuff, I've committed a crime. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so how is that not kind of like a censorship?
It
To
is.
just classify something as top secret that
Yes.
wouldn't hurt anyone and that could be
That is
told.
problematic. So say the UFO thing. I've seen some stories about UFOs. Say it's something like this. Say so there's these fighter planes flying around, and they see something they think's a UFO, and they have this camera system on it that could take pictures of it. Well, if that camera system is secret, the government might have a problem with releasing that to us because we don't want the Russians and Chinese to know we can do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is it problematic? Yes, because the government can and does abuse that at times. The press isn't just newspapers and TV, or it isn't just newspapers. For our founding fathers, that's all the press was. But does it include TV and radio and internet now? Because Hamilton never could have thought of the internet. Yeah, covers all that. Assembly means you could join teams and groups and clubs and political parties. You can protest. Freedom of assembly. Are there going to be limits? Sure. Can you protest and turn cars over and break windows and steal stuff? No. But can you meet and protest the government? Yes. If your protest is 75,000 people, should you coordinate with the city first? Yes. Otherwise, you're going to do what? You're going to shut down streets. People can't go to work. People can't get to the hospital. So there are going to be some limits to some of these freedoms. But assembly is a critical right. You could join teams, groups, clubs, political parties. Now, is this designed to protect you so you could join the chess club and the AV club and the D&D club? Not really. It's really designed to protect you in joining a political party. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Petition, poor freedom of petition. If we remember way from that first slide, nobody knows about it. Petition is to send your government complaints or request stuff. Usually done in, formally on a letter or even an email these days. You have the right to ask your government for anything. Does the government have to do it?
No.
No. You could ask for it and the government can't send the FBI to drag you away because you asked for something. The government doesn't have to do it though. Good example here locally, I was teaching this 2 years ago. One of my students raised their hand and said, "Can we have a petition?" And I'm like, "Sure." So they petitioned for the principal to bring them cinnamon rolls. You're teaching one day, door opens, it's the principal and the assistant principal bringing cinnamon rolls. Very nice way to teach freedom of petition. But again, don't think the government has to do what you're petitioning. Yes, please. All the government's limit is it can't throw you in jail for asking for something. Limits. The basic way to think about your limits to civil liberties is remember that all other citizens have their own rights and society needs to be protected and has its rights. The way some scholars talk about it is you have the rights to wave your arms around any way you want until that fist hits your neighbor in the nose. There's limits. So do I have free speech rights? Yes. Can I get on a megaphone at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of my street and wake everybody up? No. Can I have a protest? Yes. Can we walk down the street turning over cars and starting fires? No. Do I have free speech rights? Yes. Freedom of press? Yes. Can I create all kinds of crazy lies and put that into a story? No. That's not protected freedom of speech. We're going to see if you lie about somebody with spoken word that is slander. That's not protected free speech. If I do it in a story and writing, that's libel. That's not protected free speech. So the basic limits to these civil liberties are you can't violate other people's rights, and we still have to take care of the rights and safety of the rest of society in this whole idea of social contract between citizens and the government. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, you can campaign for your favorite candidate. Doing it at a megaphone at 3 o'clock in the morning in your cul-de-sac is probably not the way to do it. You could have a assembly, you could have a parade, you could have a protest. But if it's so big it's going to shut the city down, should you probably talk to the cops first so they could set the traffic up, have porta potties there, have EMS because these little old ladies pass out? Sure. So there are some restriction to these roads. The city can't say you can't protest and parade, but it can say, you know what? You got 50,000 people in your group. Can we do it on a Sunday morning in the park? Not Friday afternoon marching down the middle of Main Street. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
We break out two specific things that aren't protected free speech: slander and libel. You'll see it on the quiz. Slander is spoken lies about somebody. Libel is printed lies in like a story in a magazine or a newspaper. The way I remember it, S for speech, S for slander, not protected free speech. Libel, not protected free speech on written stuff. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm a politician. I'm a public figure. Can you say pretty much anything you want about me? Sure. Can you say I'm terrible? Yes. Can you say you disagree with me? Absolutely. Can you make up these wild lies about me? Like, Steve Biankowski, the governor of Florida, he sells crack to small children and he slaps middle schoolers. If those are all lies. Can you say that? You can say it. Is it protected free speech? No. If you're a newspaper reporter and you write all that stuff, can I now sue you? Yes. Can you say, it's freedom of the press, I'm protected, I can write whatever I want? No. Slander and libel are not protected free speech. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now I want you to remember that. Because today in politics, what do a lot of politicians say when the media says something they don't like?
Not true.
And what do they always say? What's the big one these days?
Fake news.
Fake news. That's fake news. Okay. Well, you have a remedy. If you're a high-level politician and you think the media's lying about you, fake news, sue them. Go to court and you can prove whether they're lies or not. Do you see these politicians doing that often?
No.
No. So be careful when you hear that fake news thing thrown out. Do sometimes the media get it wrong? Yes. Do sometimes they actually purposefully lie? Yes. I think you'll find they're very rare, and guess what? If they do it, can you sue them? Absolutely. Do you go to jail for libel or slander? No. You just can't use that as a valid defense. You can't say, freedom of speech, you're not protected. There's other things that aren't protected by the First Amendment. Some speech is criminal. Do you know what blackmail is, Abby?
Yes. You hold something against someone so you can get them to do what you want.
That's not protected free speech. I can't go to the judge, that was protected free speech. They're like, no, that's a crime. Just like fraud or extortion. Extortion is this: Abby, pay me $1,000 a week or I'm going to burn your store down. That's a crime called extortion. I can't say, Your Honor, protected free speech. No. So, of course, there are limits to freedom of speech, freedom of the press. They're here on the slide. We talk about libel and slander because they're the big ones, but there's other stuff too. Can I say I hate the government? Yes. Can I say the government is awful? Yes. Can I now say, all right, time block 6, go in your parents' gun safes, get every weapon you can, we're going to Washington, D.C., and we're going to shoot everybody in Congress. Is that protected free speech?
No. What about obscenity? What does that mean?
Yeah. I don't want to get into too big of a definition of obscenity because obscenity is like bad stuff. And I'm not even just talking about pornography of naked people. I'm talking about really bad stuff.
Oh, so it's not like spoken obscenities. That's not what they're talking about.
It could possibly be, but usually things that are not protected by the First Amendment isn't typically you speaking obscenity, it's like you showing it on a video.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Tinker versus Des Moines, I kind of already told the story anyway. Mary Beth and what's the brother's name? Oh, John. John and Mary Beth protesting the Vietnam War, wear the armbands with the peace symbol on it. Principals say you do it, you'll get expelled or you'll get suspended. They did it, they got suspended. Standing up for what they believed in. Parents sue, goes to the Supreme Court, and by a 7-2 ruling, the Supreme Court says that was protected free speech. You do not give up your rights just because you go to school. And that sounds all groovy, but like Abby and I already discussed, other Supreme Court rulings really narrow your freedoms in a school environment. And the basic thing they argue is school's special. You got to be able to protect the students, and you have to be able to do your job as teaching. And if the school can argue that it's so disruptive that they can't teach, or so dangerous that it threatens the student's safety, yeah, then they will say you don't have the right to do that. Are we going to agree? I just had an argument with one of my time blocks about dress code stuff. And some of the our female students were arguing, wearing a tank top, who cares? Yeah. The argument the school would have and the school district would have is that's disruptive to the classroom environment. The teachers can't do their job of teaching. So that would be the argument of why that would be a reasonable limit to your First Amendment rights. You don't have to agree, but that would be the argument. Did I at least explain that in a way you understand what the school's argument would be?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
But isn't like, nah, never mind.
Okay.
I don't want to go into a conversation too long.
This is what they were protesting. Just so we know, remember a little bit of history. The Vietnam War lasted from about 1962 to 1975. It was very unpopular with a lot of Americans for a lot of reasons. It was considered pretty brutal, and it was considered unnecessary. A lot of people did not agree that we needed to be fighting the war at all. Then we had a draft, which was kind of unfair. Guess who got drafted? Rich kids or poor kids?
Poor kids.
Poor kids. So they were going to fight this terrible war and getting blinded or legs blown off or dying there, while rich kids were sitting in college smoking dope and being safe. So this war was unpopular. It created a lot of protests, and this was the war that the Tinker kids were protesting against. So the Supreme Court does rule that yes, Tinkers' speech isn't just word. It includes expressions to include clothing or the armbands they wore. 7-2, you didn't give up your rights the moment you stepped foot in a school. Protected free speech. A little more to review Tinker versus Des Moines, because in the EOC, which we're probably going to have in June, as far as I know, Tinker versus Des Moines is one of the Supreme Court cases they like you to know about. All you really got to remember, Tinker versus Des Moines, it was all about free speech in free speech in schools. That yes, free speech does not go away just because you're in a school, and free speech includes things like clothing, art, music, not just spoken word. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. If you know those things, you'll get that EOC question right. Any questions? Have a great morning, afternoon, whatever it is.